what's key is lifting the restrictions on the use of these long-range weapons. So Ukraine needs to have US approval to strike targets inside Russia. It also, of course, it needs more aircraft in order to launch these glide bombs. So, the promise that the US will train an additional 16 F-16 pilots in the US next year is good, but it's not happening fast enough. It's not enough, and Ukrainians are still frustrated. They don't have enough pilots or planes in order to attack the Russian bases from where they're being attacked themselves.
Just want to now draw on those recent reports that you've written. Earlier this week, you did this really interesting deep dive into the planning and the evolution of Ukraine's tactics that destroyed an A-50 spy plane and damaged its airborne command centre. Can you just start by telling us exactly what these aircraft are and how they've been operating?
So the A-50 is an equivalent to a NATO AWACS. It's basically a huge airborne radar which can see for hundreds of miles across territory and penetrate deep inside Ukraine. And the Russians have been using these, flying them over the Azov Sea in order to get a great picture of what's happening in Ukrainian airspace. That allowed them to monitor Ukrainian jet activity, but also, drones and any missiles that would be fired across the border at Russia or at Russian troops inside Ukrainian territory. And this was a huge advantage that the Russians had over the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians haven't had this kind of capability. And in fact, the Ukrainians were able to shoot down 2 A-50s in kind of surprise ambushes, which involved, in one case, taking a very old Soviet missile system that had been decommissioned 11 years earlier, kind of re-engineering it, rebuilding, finding all the components, getting people who were familiar with this really antiquated system, putting it back together, and mounting it some 40 kilometers from the front line knowing the patrol route of one of these A-50s across the Azov Sea. They fired it at this A-50. They missed it the first time, but they inspired it was a Ukrainian military intelligence operation, and they inspired the Ukrainian Air Force to then take up their own action. And the Ukrainian Air Force drove a Patriot missile system with several other vehicles very, very close to the front line and ambushed another A-50 plane and shot it down at a range of nearly 200 kilometers. And the Ukrainians were then able to take the antiquated S-200 anti-aircraft system and shoot down a second A-50. And after that, the Russians simply couldn't put up any more A-50s. They didn't want to lose them. They're very valuable aircraft. And so the Ukrainians have effectively denied Russia radar view over Ukraine from these airborne aircraft. And at the same time, Ukraine is going to be getting Swedish airborne radar systems to look into Russian airspace. So the situation when they get those aircraft will change quite dramatically.
And just how risky an operation was it for the Ukrainian forces involved to take down those A-50s?
So it's incredibly risky for the Patriot battery that had to drive very, very close to the front line. We're talking 5 or 6 kilometers within artillery range of the Russians. It had to be very covert, very secretive mission, had to be done quickly, drive in, ambush the plane and drive back out. And they'd been trained by the Germans, actually, who provided this Patriot battery on trucks in this kind of operation. On the other hand, the S-200 is a completely static air defense system, and that had to be built over a number of days and then deconstructed over a number of days. So again, they had to take very good care to camouflage that and then evacuate the area in case there was retaliation, and then start dismantling it later at night over a period of a few days, and up to 13 kilometers of cables on that system.
It seems incredibly audacious, but also ingenious. And you talking to the people involved in coming up with this plan. I mean, how did they view it? What did they tell you? Presumably incredibly proud, but a very tricky operation to actually carry out.
Yeah, I mean, they're obviously proud of what they've done, and the significance of it is huge in destroying 2 aircraft which are worth $330 million each to build, and Russia is really struggling to replace them. I think the idea is always, these ideas are born out of necessity. If you have to do something, you find a way to do it. And the Ukrainians have demonstrated great ingenuity throughout the course of this conflict of solving problems that are causing them great difficulties.
How much of a dent has it actually been then to Russia's ability to control the skies?
Well, I was talking to Air Marshal Greg Bagwell the other day, who was telling me that this was a massive blow to Russia, not only in terms of the war with Ukraine, but also its ability to confront NATO. These are quite old aircraft. They're very difficult to build. They have a lot of specialist crew that are needed. And, in both instances, they lost the crew of these aircraft. That's decades of experience on that plane that could be used to train others. And they only have a handful of them. I think there's supposed to be less than 9 of these functioning A-50s. And he said that a lot of those will probably have already been cannibalized for spare parts. And the fact that Russia hasn't been able to put any more A-50s up into the air may demonstrate that the others are not flight worthy.
One of the factors behind the success was the element of surprise, wasn't it? That those aircrew never imagined they were within range. Can you explain another tactic the Ukrainians have been using, the so-called sambush? What is it and how is it being used?
So this is the idea that you take an anti-aircraft defense system, which you would primarily expect to be used to defend an area against aircraft or missiles, and use it in an offensive capacity instead of a defensive capacity. And that involves kind of driving it or placing it towards where the object that you're trying to attack is, and attacking it from very long range. And only a few of the Ukrainian systems have the capability to do this. The S-200 has a very long range. It can shoot down aircraft at high altitude, but it's not very maneuverable. So you can only hit something big like an A-50 or a strategic bomber. They also shot down using the S-200 a Tu-22 M3 nuclear-capable strategic bomber, which again affects the confrontation with NATO and Russia's ability to deliver nuclear weapons if it needs to. And the Patriot system has a shorter range, and that really had to go a lot closer to the front lines. But it's about using these objects, which are usually used in air defense in an offensive capacity. And the Ukrainians have also done this in Bryansk in May of last year. They shot down a number of planes over the Bryansk region of Russia, and they've done it over Krinky as well. And that's helped a lot with some of the glide bomb attacks on Ukrainian positions, but obviously the numbers of glide bombs are so vast that they still don't have enough Patriot systems and enough air defense systems to move around, and that's why Zelensky is in Washington at the moment saying we need more of these systems.
But yeah, another example, though, of ingenious ways of coming up with things out of necessity.
Right, and it's something that the Americans were really surprised, because they don't use their Patriot systems in that way. They use them as a kind of area defense tool, and they defend strategic objects. But the Germans had at least envisaged using these in that way. Their Patriots are mounted on trucks and are much more mobile. So, and an American defense commander was saying, this is something we hadn't witnessed in kind of 22 years of my career as an air defense commander. But the Germans were drilling the Ukrainians to kind of wake up in the early hours of the night, march somewhere, drive their vehicles somewhere to go back, fight an air defense battle, and then return. So this kind of fight, shoot and scoot, as it is known, is being applied across the Ukrainian forces, but very innovatively in air defense systems.
Can I just ask you a bit about the piece you're currently working on? As I understand it, it's about prisoner exchanges. What did you set out to do?
So I was very interested in how sporadic these prisoner exchanges are and what motivates them and how they come about, why it happens sometimes or why it's not consistent, what the Russians are asking for when they have these prisoner exchanges. And there was a very long hiatus in prisoner exchanges before Ukraine invaded the Kursk region of Russia. So I was looking at why that had been, and then suddenly there were mass prisoner exchanges after that. So the Ukrainians had captured a lot of conscripts during the Kursk operation, and they were young people from places that could be St. Petersburg or Moscow, who were told that they would never be in a frontline battle, and the families of those were quite outraged that they had been captured when they shouldn't be anywhere near the front line, and that had put some pressure on Putin, and suddenly he was willing to negotiate this. But the Ukrainians said that the reason these negotiations had slowed down before was that all of the kind of Russian contract soldiers and kind of prisoners and people that had been captured before, the Russians weren't really interested in retrieving them. And they were only interested in extracting as much as they could, as many concessions as they could from the Ukrainians in order to get the Ukrainian prisoners back. The Ukrainians are very keen on bringing back their people. And one person that I spoke to who's party to this negotiation said it was something like an 18th century slave market. It wasn't a humanitarian mission. It wasn't a humanitarian exercise. The Russians just wanted to get as many of their people out in return for as few Ukrainians being released as possible. And every time the Ukrainians would go to the negotiating table, the Russians would come back with some ridiculous demand that they were unable to meet.
Did you learn much about the process?
Yeah, so it's quite an interesting process. So the Russians don't have a coordination center in the same way that Ukrainians have. It's not very organized. The Ukrainians have to reach out to different people. They were talking about how Kadyrov is very interested in getting his Chechens back. So if you capture a Chechen, that's great because you almost certainly will get a prisoner of war back in exchange for a Chechen. But the Russian government is not really interested in it. And the Ukrainians have informal routes with people that, the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic, so-called republics that Russia set up in 2014. The Ukrainians have links to some of those, and they're able to negotiate with them on those bases.
And there's one particular story that you featured. Can you tell me a bit more about the woman, the veteran? She's a serving soldier, is that right?
She's a former soldier, so a former combat medic who was fighting in Mariupol, and she was captured during the defense of Azovstal, along with her husband, who was in a separate fighting unit. And they were held in Russia for a period of time after the fall of Azovstal. She was then released as part of a prisoner exchange, but her husband was not. He stayed in Russia. And she has desperately been trying to get her husband back after this and facing blockage. And it's very difficult for the families, even on the Ukrainian side, because the process is quite opaque. And the Ukrainian Coordination Center says, look, it's actually unhelpful for us to name who we want, because if we say who we want to the Russians, they try and extract a higher price from us. So we're kind of dealing with, we give them the list, but then see what happens.
The danger is when you've done something and it hasn't really achieved what you expected to achieve, you then look for other reference points to try and claim success. I have to say, as a purely military guy, you generally operate, you've never got enough resources to do everything you want to do. So you have this lovely term of main effort. Where do you focus your priorities? And it's very dangerous to have more than one main effort. And what appears to have happened is that Zelensky is judged that by having, invading an incursion into Kursk, that would not only embarrass Putin, force him to do something about it, and potentially undermine his position back in Russia. Now, there's a couple of things to unwrap in there. One of which is, Putin is sustained by a democracy of sorts, not really. It's the oligarchs that keep him up there. And Putin also controls the narrative out to the country. And if that narrative is we're winning, it's nothing to worry about, all of a sudden a whole area of the country has been invaded, 120,000 people have had to be evacuated. They all talk. And of course, it is another chink in the dam. But do most experts believe that's going to be enough to topple Putin? Almost certainly not. And the worry is, of course, that from a military perspective, you put potentially 10,000 of your fighters, Ukrainian fighters, into an area of Russia that really doesn't count. And Russia can fix those fighters there, whilst it worries about fighting in the Donbass. And if you look at it purely in a sort of graphic, objective perspective, Russia has accelerated its progress in the Donbass since the time of the Kursk invasion. Now, again, you can't directly link those two because, as a military guy, I would argue that Russia is pushing hard in the Donbass to try to achieve its objectives before the end of this fighting season, because, frankly, Russia is losing so many soldiers at the moment that it's faster than it can actually recruit them. Therefore, it's not a sustainable model. But if, and there's a big if, but if Putin can complete that task before the winter settles in, that times with about the time of the US elections. It's possible there will change of administration, possible that President Trump might try to do a deal with President Putin, and therefore he'd want to be at that situation, that talk, in a most powerful situation that he could be. So overall, I think it's too early to say, but it doesn't appear to have achieved the objectives that President Zelensky probably would have wanted from that incursion.
If we do get confirmation that the West will allow Ukraine to use Storm Shadow missiles to hit targets inside Russia, how big a difference will that make, Sean? I'm conscious of the fact that for months we were talking about the F-16s potentially being a game changer. And in and of themselves, yes, they will make a difference. Some might say they're making a limited difference already, but they're not going to transform the war. There's no one game-changing weapon. But how significant would you say the Storm Shadows are?
I think less significant than possibly we in the media are sort of painting them out to be. I think if we go back to the F-16s, I think they could have been a game changer, but for the fact that Ukraine has so few pilots that are trained to operate them. If rumours are to believe, there's less than single figures of pilots. So it doesn't matter the fact that they've been promised 85 F-16s. If you've only got a dozen or so pilots, then there's very limited effect you can actually achieve. I think the weapons front, though, is interesting because I have no doubt at all that the supply of weapons, let's take Storm Shadow, because that's one of the weapons we talk about. In big handfuls, I think the UK bought about 1,000 of those 30 years ago. It cost about 2 million each. I think in the intervening period, we've used less than 200 of them in actual conflict. It got to the stage where they were time expired and we therefore needed to upgrade them. We've decided to upgrade not all of those that are remaining. I understand it's only a few hundred to be upgraded. And that left us with several hundred of these missiles that we either disposed of, that would have cost us money, or we stored them, that would have cost us money. So one of the options when the war happened was, yes, we can give these weapons to Ukraine. It saves us money, but also because it's 30-year-old technology, we're not that worried if that falls into the Russians' hands. My point being, though, it's a very limited supply of those weapons. And my understanding is that Ukraine's had most of them already. So the fact that if they gave them the permission to use them even further inside Russia, Ukraine would still be faced with this very limited supply. I think the story that's happening behind the scenes, excuse me, much more important is that either you make or buy. And if you can't buy something, you have to make it. And one of the things that's interesting at the moment is Ukraine seems to have developed its own skunk works, its own way of rapidly developing weapons. It's developed its own ballistic missile, and it's developed its own long-range drone. Now, you can't just suddenly magic that from nowhere. I wouldn't be at all surprised if the West is providing technology and components, but now they're a lot easier to provide in bulk. As long as President Zelensky's team can put them together, if you're in the West, you'd have to do a whole lot of safety cases. You'd have to make sure that you did loads of test flying to make sure that they were robust and credible. That can take years. If you're in Ukraine, you don't do any of that. You bolt them together and fly them on a mission. So I think and we've seen over the last few weeks, a much increased tempo of very effective strikes by Ukraine deep inside Russia, beyond the range of Storm Shadow and ATACMS missiles. And I suspect the conversation behind closed doors is that this is not about giving Ukraine a military effect. The danger is that the overwhelming issue is political, that actually by giving Zelensky permission, that political intent inflames Russia. And therefore, why would you do that? If there is another way of giving Ukraine the capability they need, which is the technology and the components, then maybe they can build them for themselves and potentially do it a lot quicker, a lot cheaper, and a lot more effectively.
President Zelensky is in New York for the UN General Assembly. We're expecting him to address the UN General Assembly on Wednesday this week. And of course, he'll have lots of meetings significantly with President Biden and other world leaders. Where do you think we are in terms of Western support for Ukraine at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, how long have we got and where's the bottle of wine to answer that question? Frankly, if you look at the war from a grand strategic perspective, it's not really been going Ukraine's way this year. If you look at it as fighting seasons, I know it's flippant, but when it gets into the late autumn, early winter, it's freezing cold. It's very much more difficult to conduct maneuver warfare. At the start of this year, Ukraine was waiting for $60 billion of aid. It didn't come. That left them short of weapons. Russia capitalized. Jumped on the front foot, and it's been the tale of the war this year, with Russia pushing harder and harder forward. We can talk about that certainly in more detail. But the Ukraine pushed into Kursk, but potentially as a distraction. Has that really worked? Probably not. And still, the Russians are pushing forward. Now, Ukraine knows full well that it relies heavily on the West for financial and military support. If you remember back, was it last year, the spring offensive, the West effectively opened the cupboards, saying we can virtually give you whatever you want if you can, break through. it didn't happen. The West has continued to supply weapons, but it hasn't. It's almost certainly helped the Ukrainians, but it hasn't stopped Russia grinding away in this war of attrition. And the worry here, I think, in big picture, is that the stockpiles of Western weapons upon which Ukraine has relied are virtually empty, and therefore you rely now on a factory spinning up, generating new weapons. And that's not as easy as it sounds to do. Yes, you can generate bullets and artillery shells, dumb weapons, relatively quickly. But frankly, the more weapons like that you provide the Ukrainians, the more you drag them into a war of attrition, which is just the war they don't want to fight. And I think one of the really important things about Zelensky's visit is that he's apparently going to be briefing US leaders on his victory plan. We don't know much about it, but we understand that there are three components to it, one of which is, the supply of weapons, the future supply. How do you stop this being feast and famine? How do you provide a degree of continuity? There's also about how the West provides more coherent diplomatic pressure, bring it to bear on Russia. And finally, how you hold Russia accountable long term for this illegal invasion. But again, behind closed doors, who knows what's actually being talked about. But I'd be very surprised also if they're not also talking about the use of long-range weapons, which President Zelensky has been regularly appealing to the West to try to take the restrictions off and allow him to use the weapons as he sees fit, providing they're used in accordance with the law of armed conflict.
The Russians actually have been very significant in this ability to make us afraid to do what's required to win by making all these threats that they have almost never followed through on. Now, that doesn't mean there wouldn't be an escalation, subversion, sabotage, other acts that we've seen escalating within Europe, but all of those things are being done by Russia to try and not have a direct conflict with NATO. They argue they're in conflict with NATO. They put out propaganda almost nightly they're in conflict with NATO. They run simulations on their evening TV programs of what a nuclear strike on London would look like, and they've been doing that for 2 years. But the reality is they don't want a war with NATO because they would lose. They're barely winning a war against Ukraine on its own with fairly iffy support from the West in many ways. It's certainly shy of a massive commitment to win. So they don't want it. They want to threaten it because it scares us and we don't help Ukraine. And that's how they win this war. It's as simple as that. To do things that would actually start a war with NATO, it's a very risky thing. Now, they'd love to break NATO up. They'd love to fracture the alliance so that it loses cohesion. America pulls out of Europe. The US is no longer supporting the backbone of our defense. They'd love to see that. They'd love to see the Baltics get harassed to the point that there was something that should trigger Article 5 that doesn't, and NATO becomes irrelevant when Article 5 is potentially triggered and it is vetoed and there is no collective defense. These are Russian victories in the long term, but they don't achieve that by doing something that's so clear, say a strike on Poland, that the Poles say, that's it. You're going to face something back for this. Because again, Russia comes out of this badly. They need us to be frightened. They've succeeded in that to the point we're having this debate.
Just on the Storm Shadows, if these are British weapons and the same for the French supplied Scout weapons, why do we need the approval of the US government for them to be used by Ukraine if we've given them to Ukraine?
I think there's a few angles to it. There's lots of things talked about where they use US systems or, if you speak to other people, well, of course, some of the data might come from the US, or you speak to someone else and say, well, they can only get them to the target if they use other US systems alongside it. And I think that's all a bit of a bluff. I mean, I think the real point here around that is the fact that we're trying to move forward as an alliance. And if the US doesn't like things, it risks fracturing that unity of moving forward. And of course, no nation truly wants to be the one that absolutely breaks ranks and wades into this and then finds everyone else didn't follow them. And now they're in a war with Russia and everyone else says you brought that on yourselves. So I think there is this real desire to move forward as an alliance with clear commitment from everyone. So again, if the UK was to just cross the lines, because on the same point, you could say, well, maybe the Poles should send 50,000 soldiers, armoured vehicles and their air force to defend Ukraine. And if they just did that on their own without consulting everyone else, I'm pretty sure the Russians would say, okay, Poland, you're in the fight. And I'm not sure that the UK and France would say, well, we're behind them all the way after they took that unilateral action. I think that's now a Poland-Russia conflict. And again, that's how Russia wins, because they get to pick off nations one by one within NATO. So that temptation to act unilaterally is really, really dangerous, because it would allow nations to actually get broken away from the alliance and eaten one by one. in the worst case. I'm giving a very extreme scenario. I've got no suggestion that Poland's going to go piling into Ukraine. But once upon a time in the world, that's something that could have happened. With NATO, no, we need to move together. We need to maintain collective defence and deterrence. And so the US is really important for this. Now, that said, the UK has been the nation that has pushed boundaries the most, supplying main battle tanks, doing training for pilots before anyone else, even if we didn't supply airframes. We always pushed the boundaries and pushed at Russia's red lines. And there's a reason that the UK is singled out by Russia and Russian propaganda just so often. And, there's this almost constant contemptuous statement that they could just wipe us off the map with their nuclear weapons if they felt like it. But we're the aggressors, in that narrative. It sort of shows actually how annoyed they were, and particularly at Boris Johnson, who sort of, if you go to Kyiv, there are paintings of Boris that local artists have done because they're so grateful for the support he gave right at the start of the conflict that drew the lines, and that the UK said, actually, we will back you. We feel we should and we must. That set the tone for others. And so we are the people pushing for this because we always have been pushing to do more for Ukraine. The US are the people that are the gatekeepers, frankly, because they're 50% of the military support and the heart of the NATO military alliance.
And again, on the point about American approval for the use of Storm Shadows, there might be some who go, well, look, Ukraine have got them already. As you mentioned, they've been using them in Crimea. Why not just use them on military targets inside Russia? And what are the Western allies going to do? I mean, as far as we're aware, there was no prior approval of the Kursk incursion. Had they said we're thinking of physically invading Russia, they probably would have been told, absolutely do not do that. So is that something Zelensky will have privately considered?
I'm sure they thought about it. It's like, we got these things, we could use them. But of course, what guarantees were given when we offered them? And the deal was very much you can have these and the support and the know-how and the engineering support and everything else to use them, but on the basis that they don't cross this particular line. And of course, a nation that's under desperate threat might say, well, forget that, we just need to do this. But the Ukrainians know if they did that, that would be the end of any further support for them, potentially international pressure to say, right, stop this conflict. So I'm sure they thought about it. I'd sure be thinking about it and saying, well, we could just do it anyway, but that would be the only chance we'd get to use them, because after that, you might find that a lot of things stop happening for us. So, and Ukraine has occasionally, done things that I think in private aroused a certain degree of annoyance from its backers. And I think conversations are had afterwards sometimes about things. And I think, of course, the Ukrainians go, well, we're the ones in the battle for survival. You're not, sorry, we're seeking forgiveness, not asking permission. But I think on this one, it's such heavily loaded and it's such a red line, it's not worth them doing it overall. And of course, Ukraine is adapting and finding other ways to strike at these targets. They're developing their own missiles and know-how. They were doing that before the conflict. They've obviously accelerated that. And they are developing longer range weapons of their own. And if nothing else, being able to be allowed to use Western weapons within the operational theatre, if you like, so not within the internationally recognised boundaries of Russia, well, then whatever they can make, which is probably going to be quite a low rate of production, at least they can then use that outside the borders. So, hey, you know what? We'll keep using ATACMS and Storm Shadow inside our borders, and we use our low-rate production indigenous weapon systems for things further afield, which is what they are doing. But imagine the effect, of course, if out of a clear blue sky one morning they could use the whole lot, against Russian military targets, logistics hubs, training grounds, railway networks, all the things that are supporting the effort on the front lines, and they could hit them at the same time. That would be closer to a knockout blow that would help the front lines. Dribbling attacks creates problems for the Russians, but it isn't a knockout blow. And Russia's got that problem against Ukraine itself, even with their access to weapons, that they can't deliver knockout blows on Ukrainian infrastructure. They just can't mass the amount of weapons and systems needed to do that. And Ukraine faces the same problem, of course, but Ukraine has nowhere to hide. Russian troops at the moment can basically cross the border into Russia and don't have to fear a Storm Shadow. They might have to fear an improvised drone, and they should be at the moment, because those are going 1,000+ miles into Russia and hitting very high value targets. But in general, you're safe in Russia in a way that you're not safe in Crimea and you're not safe in the Donbass.
Ukraine has really shown what it can do on deep strikes using drones in Russia, with these recent attacks it's carried out on a large armament depot in Toropet and then a huge depot in Tihoretsk. I'm not quite sure if I've said that right, but apologies if I haven't, to our audience. Is Ukraine reaching the point where it can seriously slow Russia's ability to wage war by methodically targeting Russian logistics at source?
100%. And by the way, I think that's been the case from the very beginning. It's just been giving them the means to do so. I mean, they are steely warriors. and they're crafty in the way that they design their missions, and they're pretty audacious too. So the ability to strike into the Russian depth, disrupt their logistics, disrupt their command and control, is definitely the way that a David fights a Goliath. That is definitely the sort of, in the Western NATO parlance, we call it the maneuverist approach. You don't pit strength against strength. You seek to push strength against what you perceive to be your adversary's weakness, and invariably the sort of depth is weaker than their depth positions, where their logistics and their command and control are invariably easier targets, softer targets than the sort of armored formations that are close in. So I think we should be doubling down on our support for Ukraine with that sort of capability. Just take the legs from under the Russian offensive, and then grind them to a standstill, and then attrite them with glide bombs.
And the advantage to all of this is that it actually takes the stuff doesn't even get to the battlefield in the first place.
Exactly that, and that has two effects. There are sort of three parts of combat power: the conceptual, how do you fight; the physical, what do you fight with; and the mental, do you have the will to fight? And actually, when you're attacking logistics chains, you're attacking two of those three components of fighting power. Physical, obviously, you're removing ammunition, you're removing supplies, you're removing replacement vehicles and fighting platforms. But on the moral component side, if an army on the front line starts to doubt that it's going to get more ammunition, more food, more water, that it's going to lose all of the support that it needs to keep going, it will very quickly lose the will to keep pushing forwards, because it'll be worried that it becomes ever more isolated, unsustainable, and will end up meeting a grisly end. So getting after the logistics train is a very, very, very potent way of halting an army. And I think the Ukrainians should double down on doing exactly that.
And you mentioned just briefly there glide bombs. What are you suggesting Ukraine should have or should be able to do?
Well, look, I think the announcement that the US are going to furnish Ukraine with glide bombs is a very big deal. It is the Russian use of glide bombs has proven to be devastating. Real mass of munitions that you can just drop on front lines that can't be interdicted by electronic warfare or anything else. Just gravity doing what it does, and it's been incredibly effective. So giving the Ukrainians the American equivalent of the system that the Russians have been using sends a really big message to Russia that they'll reap what they sow, but also says to the Ukrainians that here's another commitment that the US is making to the Ukrainian cause. It's not the absolute top of Zelensky's list. That was the ability to use ATACMS onto Russian soil, but nonetheless, as a consolation prize, walking away with a new supply of glide bombs, is it Joint Strike Weapon they call it? That's a really big win for Ukraine, and will have a big psychological effect on the Russian front lines when these glide bombs. And I think I read earlier today in some of the immediate reporting of the announcement that they're likely to be glide bombs carrying cluster munitions. Well, cluster munitions are the absolute devil for enemy in trenches on the front line, because they just they obliterate a really wide area as they are deployed. And the psychological impact of that, when you're hunkered down in your trench, already hiding from some pretty miserable weather, and then all of a sudden you start just having all these bomblets raining down on you. Awful, awful, awful experience, and may well break the Russian will. Who knows?
Do we know how many and when?
No, I've not seen anything on that. I've just a headline announcement that they are part of the new package.
It's really, really interesting development, isn't it? And
It
something
is.
that's been the bane of the Ukrainian forces' life. So interesting to see the tables turn and the effect that's actually going to have in the coming months,
100%.
if it is in the coming months. Just wanted, if I may, to draw your attention or get your thoughts on some comments made by the French president, Emmanuel Macron, in his international meeting for peace in Paris. He called on a new international order and a rethink on relations with Russia in the future, and the organisation of Europe, acknowledging that the current world order created after World War II was incomplete. A new model needed to take into account equal representation for all European nationals and larger peace-building tactics. Why do you think he's saying this, and do you think he has a point?
Well, look,
You're looking for the diplomatic answer, aren't you?
yeah, look, so it's not language that I would seek to use at this point, because I think it can sound awfully conciliatory to Russia. And I've never subscribed. There was a time at the very beginning of the war where the media handling advice for me as a UK minister, as a regular spokesman for the UK government, was to really, and relentlessly say, Putin, never Russia, in my sort of condemnation of what was going on. And the big idea was we needed to vilify Putin, alienate him from the wider Russian elite, but not alienate Russia from the European community that we hope one day to reconcile it to. I think Putin, I think Macron is, communicating today in a very similar vein, and it's definitely the case that whether Russia, hopefully Russia will be completely vanquished in Ukraine, and when a vanquished Russia, licking its wounds, probably going through some very traumatic political moment as well, looks westwards, I think it probably does matter to sort of validate Macron's point that Russia feels like there is a route back to being a part of the European Union. There's no doubt that the Russian elite in Moscow, and particularly St. Petersburg, see themselves as Europeans, not Asians with China as their obvious partner. But I think that Macron is choosing, when Zelensky is in New York talking about victory and trying to embolden both sides of the US political system to stick with them for another year, another 2 years, another 3 years, maybe having that sort of talk about a sort of reconciliation with Russia feels a bit premature and counterproductive at this particular moment.
What do you think that Western countries should be doing now to prepare for a post-Putin Russia, to avoid the kind of mistakes of the 1990s when the Soviet Union collapsed?
Well, I dispute whether or not the way that the West engaged with Russia in the 90s and early 2000s was particularly wrong-headed. I think that the return of someone like Putin, it just played to a sense of Russian nationalism and Russian identity as a superpower. And in the immediate aftermath of the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia was going through some pretty significant internal domestic things. And I think the West has to be really careful, because if the West is too visibly seeking to take over and be part of a transition in Russia after the war in Ukraine, appears to be meddling in Russian politics, I think the reaction of the Russian people will be incredibly negative. So if I were the West, I would focus on defeating the Russian army in Ukraine, restoring as much territory as possible, if not even all of that territory, then worry about what you do in Russia thereafter. I think if you try and run with hound and hare, zero compromise on the battlefield in Ukraine, whilst hinting at compromise around the wider long-term strategic relationship, I just think you kind of, it just...
Confused.
Yeah, exactly.
And as for ending the war in Ukraine, there are some hard choices ahead, aren't there? There was once the Zelensky mantra of victory at any cost. Is he now facing the prospect of peace on the best terms possible? And if so, what would that look like?
Look, so I no longer have any privileged information. So this is simply my reflection on the mood music of his trip to the UN General Assembly and then onwards to Washington. It feels to me as if they are starting to see an off-ramp that might not be full territorial restitution. But my view is that the position of the UK government and the wider donor community should be that that is our aim until it is explicit from the Ukrainian government that that is no longer what they're seeking to achieve. That I think the moment that you even half indulge that Putin gets to bank any of his territorial game, the game is up. I mean, you might as well effectively just draw stumps immediately. So until Zelensky wants to stand up and say that, I think we all have to keep giving them everything they need to achieve an absolute victory.
Here today at the Labour conference, we've heard speeches from David Lammy, Foreign Secretary of the UK, John Healey, Defence Secretary. They've both reiterated that dedication and support to Ukraine. I think it's the $3 billion they've now promised in addition. And they've stuck to the line to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. That line has been attacked, criticised by some for being, in a way, too vague. But is that more careful, verbal approach needed when things like deep strikes into Russia are being discussed behind the scenes?
You know, there's a danger in defence when you're fighting a war of being too public of what you're doing. I mean, it's each side, we're reacting to what the Russians are saying and doing, and they're doing the same. We need to keep the element of surprise. We need to keep adaptability. Deterrence relies on clear signals, but it also relies on a degree of ambiguity. So as long as it takes, of course, is ambiguous, what does that mean? What is it? And President Zelensky, of course, is playing an ambiguous game as well. He's asking for everything he can get. He appeals to our public opinion, and when we're divided, he sees that and tries to achieve things in his own country's interests. Our interests are not exactly the same as those of Ukraine. Ukraine would like us to be fighting on the front line with him, British troops and American troops. But our governments have, I think quite rightly, assessed so far that that's a risk we're not prepared to take. But we're prepared to do just about everything else, which I think is also right. So there's going to be a lot of uncertainty. And of course, this has all been taking place in a context where any discussion of negotiation has been for the birds, and I think it still is. But there may be a moment next year, I would argue, maybe in the spring next year, where there will be more momentum towards that, and we need to be prepared to put Ukraine in the best possible position for those negotiations so that they can maintain their independence. And so if there is to be any sort of armistice or wind down of the conflict, that it doesn't just give breathing space for Russia, it also gives breathing space for Ukraine. And
just to finish off, is there anything further that you're going to be listening out for here at conference from Keir Starmer, perhaps in the speech tomorrow, that could change things on the ground at all in Ukraine?
You know, I think that when people are in the Kremlin are calculating the staying power of the NATO alliance, they have looked at the experience of recent conflicts in which we've been all in, but then we've pulled out, which is what happened in Afghanistan. They do look at the election results in several European countries, including Germany and France, and indeed the Netherlands, and see parties gaining votes which are more sympathetic to Russia and want to pull back aid to Ukraine. But they also see a British government and indeed a British political consensus. It's not a Labour issue, actually. All our big political parties, Labour, Conservative, Lib Dem, are all full square behind this effort. So the UK is going to be a critical part of persuading Putin that Europe is not for changing. Of course, the countries of Northern Europe, the Scandinavians, Norwegians, Swedes, Finns, and indeed the East Europeans have always been very strong on the Ukraine question because of geography. But the fact that the UK is with them, I think, is making a real difference. There is an alternative universe, we've seen it in the past, in which the UK has focused its defence efforts globally. It's to some extent allowed Europeans to balance off each other, offshore balancing it's sometimes called. But that's not the approach the UK is taking. We are in it. We're committed to European security, and that's, I think, a very important signal which I hope we continue to send.
In a joint statement with MI6 earlier this month, CIA Director William Burns said that the Kursk incursion was causing doubts in Putin's regime and within the Kremlin. Are there any further signs that, you know, the deep strikes, the discussions that have been going on last week with America, could cause further instability within the Kremlin?
I'm doubtful that this will cause that degree of instability. It's very hard to tell. The Prigozhin rebellion went on for months and did seem to be quite a significant threat, and it was very striking how many key Russian leaders didn't fall in behind Putin immediately when that march to Moscow, abortive march to Moscow, started. But I think I would put more emphasis on the fact that in the end, this has turned into a war of attrition. The biggest problem both sides have in very different ways is how long can they sustain the war. Both sides are finding it hard to resupply their forces. There's certainly reports that by autumn of 2025, a lot of key assets Russia will have very few armoured vehicles left, for example, at current rates of attrition. And that's also true actually of our artillery shells. And of course, Ukraine, we know their problems, increasingly reliant on rather unreliable Western supplies. So that's I think, so there is a question of who breaks first. And the Ukrainian side is a real shortage of personnel. They've lost proportionately and a large number of military-age males, and that's hurting. And Ukrainians are leaving, even though men are not supposed to leave, but they are leaving. So both sides, I think, are hoping that in that war of attrition, the other side will cave, and that might well be the case. You could see this long period of a static front line suddenly dissolving as one side can't any longer hold the front, and then things could change rather quickly. Now that your calculus of that long-range battle should be seen in that context. Maybe the other risk, which Russia does not face, but Ukraine does, is one of economic collapse. The targeting of the energy infrastructure is very significant, and Ukrainians have an incredible degree of resilience, but nevertheless, if they don't have electricity and heating this winter, then that will put an enormous strain on the civilian economy, which in the end is necessary to support the military effort. So I think that's something we should really be worried about. I think a more probable scenario is we'll go into next spring. The situation on the ground, the line between the two sides won't have changed that much. And we'll have, with a new American president, we'll have renewed interest in whether there is trade space for some sort of negotiation. It feels right now the two sides are far apart. Their objectives are fundamentally incompatible. But in all conflicts, when you can get to a hurting stalemate in which the parties to conflict are prepared to compromise on their ultimate objectives because they're hurting so much. And we may be approaching that point sometime next year.
And you speak about the length this war has gone on for now. Do you think the Kremlin ever expected this level of response and support from Ukraine's European allies and the US as well?
Deterrence almost always fails because of miscalculation by one side or another, and it's not a simple calculus. Ukrainians did not predict that they would fight so well and for so long, and the Russians didn't either. If in those first days Russian special forces, the hit squads that were sent into Kyiv, had killed Zelensky and many of his co-leaders, then it's possible the Ukrainian situation would have been a lot worse. And ultimately, this invasion was actually a special forces led effort. It was not a military-led effort. It was not designed by the Russian military, and the Russian element of the invasion was very poorly organized, although they did very well in the south. Let's not forget they failed in the north, but they succeeded to take a large amount of territory in the south relatively quickly. So yes, I think Putin wouldn't have predicted this, but he's still in the game. Russia can still win this conflict. There is a plausible scenario in which Western support falters, Ukrainian morale declines, there's a significant Russian breakthrough in the Donbass, and a new American president decides to cut their losses, as they did in Afghanistan not so long ago. So Ukraine is not as vital to the United States as it necessarily is to Europe, at least to some American leaders, and we know how divided the United States is in this. So there is a plausible path to victory for Putin, and I think what the next months will be about is making it clear to Putin that there is no plausible path to victory, and he needs to get round the negotiating table seriously. And for that, the immediate task for the UK and our allies is to ensure that President Zelensky can go into those negotiations with a strong hand so he can achieve most of what he wants. And most of all, of course, what Ukraine wants is the ability to be independent and determine its own course.
And so, where do you think we are on that at the moment? Do you see any signals coming out about whether Putin thinks that path to victory, Trump still possibly on route to win in November? Do you think, looking at that situation and where Ukraine is now on the ground, Putin is feeling, the Kremlin are feeling confident, they think they've got that route to victory now? Or is this still on a bit of a knife edge for them?
I think it isn't a knife edge. But I think if I were in the Kremlin with the information I can see, I would say that I still have a plausible path to victory. It's not at all guaranteed, maybe not even probable, but it is plausible, and it would be such a geostrategic victory for Russia, such a gain for the credibility of the Russian leadership to their own people. And fundamentally, for most Russians, Ukraine is part of historic Russia. It's been part of the Tsarist Empire for a long time. Ukrainian nationalism has, of course, also always been there. But the Russian Empire has involved for centuries the subjugation of other peoples, and Ukraine has been central to that. And a lot of intermarriage and significant number of Russian speakers in Ukraine, including, of course, President Zelensky himself. So achieving that would be such a gain for Putin, but it may be out of his grasp, and I think it's very much in our interest in the UK and other European countries to ensure it remains outside his grasp. This is not a battle for Donbass. This is not a battle for Crimea. Russia had large part of the Donbass and Crimea already. They didn't fight this war in order to gain a little bit more of Donbass. They fought it because Russia believes, Putin believes, that Ukraine must be subjugated and subordinated, perhaps fully integrated into Russia, or at least most of Ukraine. As long as Odessa and Kyiv and other main cities to some extent, but most of all those, are out of Russia's grasp, Ukraine can continue as a modern state, a state which will be even more antagonistic to Russia, much more antagonistic to Russia than it was in the past. And that's a strategic loss which any Russian regime will find hard to stomach.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.